Ready?
Ready.
Yes, I wasn't. Hi everyone and welcome to the Big Ass Random Debate Show. At least that's the working title that we have currently. Sponsored by Pirate Beer. Woo! It's the pirate life. There's no life like the pirate life. Now we're gonna start with responses to questions that you've asked. But the first question we're gonna go to is this one, which is about how to structure your speech during a debate. Difficult to structurize what I'm going to talk through in front of an adjudicator, and all my friends in debate have good progress. So I think my progress is only stuck at one point, and right now I'm almost giving up on that situation. But you believe the debate can change your life. So first thing I'm going to say is don't give up on that situation, and you're absolutely right that debate can change your life.
Well, I think the first thing that's worth keeping in mind is there's lots of different ideas about structure. People will tell you all sorts of sort of golden rules, and we might talk about some of those now, but the most important thing to keep in mind is what the purpose is of structure. The reason why adjudicators and coaches hammer on all the time about having good structure is because it's actually really important to helping an audience to follow and understand your argument. It's not just there to be a barrier or some sort of technical box you have to tick. If you've got good structure, what that means is that your argument is clear and easy to follow from the point of view of the flow of the argument rather than from just your general manner and speaking skills, which is another important component of making your argument easy to follow. So there's lots of ways to have good structure. You'll know you're doing good structure when your argument is easy to follow. Now, what does it mean to have an argument that's easy to follow? Well, the first thing is that it follows logically. So you're starting out with the basic information that's needed. You're building the core principles first before you go on to talk about the practical application of those principles, or you're talking about immediate issues before you talk about longer term issues. So you're thinking about how information flows and how people learn and acquire new information. The second thing to be clear about structure is it never wants to be distracting. So you can have sort of hyper method where you're too heavily signposting everything. And so my first argument is going to be this, and my first part of my first argument is this, and then my second part of my first argument is this, and then my third part, and that's too distracting and there's too much to it. So it needs to be as minimal as possible in order to be clear and structured. And what the other thing that good structure should do is it should show how you're prioritizing your case, both in terms of the order in which things come out and the amount of time that you spend on different things. So good structure doesn't mean spending the exact same amount of time on each argument that you're making. It means spending more time on the things that matter more and less on the things that are less important, and obviously no time at all on the things that aren't very important or have no value in the debate at all. So your structure and your timing and your method are some of the ways you show an audience and an adjudicator what's most important in a debate, because the things that you spend the most time on are the things you're telling the audience they should think about the most. And so if you're stuck in a loop explaining one argument in too much detail, that's harming your case because it's making that one issue more important in the debate when actually, relatively speaking, it shouldn't be that important.
Yep, absolutely agreed. Especially the last point where it's you focus on priority and what is useful for that debate. I'd say what really helped me when I was debating is having kind of 3 stages of structure. Having the pre-structure before I say something, I'm going to try to explain that. And then while I'm saying something, I'm going to highlight what I'm saying. And then the post-structure, as in after I've said something, I'm going to tell you what I've said and then restructure that. And this is really helpful because the first part of that sets expectations for the judges. What's coming up. And if you think about the perspective of the judges, they're trying to keep track of the 1,000 different fantastic arguments that you're making, and they're very limited. Judges are often because they can't write as fast, not intellectually limited. So you need to make these things really clear so they can write those things down, and the more things that they can track, the easier it is for them to evaluate it. Right? So put those things down pretty quickly. Make it useful. As Tim was saying, you don't want to say stuff like, I'm going to make 3 arguments and then I'm going to have a summary. Like everyone has 3 arguments and then has a summary. But say what those important arguments are. And do that in your pre. And then while you're making those arguments, tell them what arguments you are making. I'm making this argument now as I have structured it. When you have finished making that argument, transition that argument. often when people say, oh, you didn't have good structure, I didn't understand what you were saying, debaters think they're talking about your signposting. They aren't talking about their signposting. They're talking about how clear it was, how easy it was for me to follow your speech. And structure is often about that transition point, knowing when you've finished one argument and you've moved on to the next argument, right? Because then as a judge, I think you're stuck in doing the previous thing, and then I get confused and I'm not sure what you're trying to prove. And that's why that structure is important, because I'm trying to think about what is the value of this argument. What is this argument moving? Which burden is this argument connected to? This example that you've dropped in here, what is the value of this example? Why are you making this? And structure does all of those things. So the during part is really important because it tells me where this fits. Is this connected to your definition? Is this connected to your first argument or your second argument or whatever? And then at the end of your speech or that argument, do a little post-structuring. Say, now I've made my first argument. This is what that argument is about. And move on to the second one. Or at the end of my speech, I've done 3 things for you. I've done this, this, and this. And that's really useful as a kind of cheat also. If your speech is really messy and you weren't sure what you were trying to do, at the end of your speech, just throw in this little post structure and pretend that's what you're planning to do throughout your entire speech, right? So in my speech, I've done 4 arguments. Never mind, at the start of your speech, you said you're going to do 2. At the end, said you did 4, and this was the 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've done these things. Fantastic job. Slow down when you're doing it though, because a really important part of structure is making sure that people get what you're saying. So don't do a summary for the sake of doing a summary, just so you said the word summary, but do it nice and slow so the judges get it and they manage to write it down, or they manage to kind of sink into what they're doing at that point.
Yeah, and the really important part of that sort of post structure is also about being really clear when you're moving between one argument and another argument. You'd be surprised by how often people are unclear, and as an adjudicator, you're just sort of writing down all these things people are saying, and as far as you can tell, it's all just one kind of unbundled thought that's all just kind of unspooling. So be very clear. My first argument is about the philosophical reason why this is a good thing to do. You make that point, and you say at the end, so I've shown you the philosophical reason why. Now I'm going to go on in my second argument to show you why practically this is the most effective solution, and talk about that. So it's very clear when you transition from one to another. And also, so it's very clear when you're transitioning from making rebuttal points to making constructive arguments. And it's quite fashionable these days for teams to combine rebuttal and constructive points into one. People talk about, I'm going to integrate my arguments and my rebuttal together, and that's okay. And the rules don't say that you can't do that. So if you feel comfortable doing that, do that. But personally, it's not something that I would do very often, because I think it very strongly risks your case being messy, and you have to have very strong and clear structure, both in terms of your manner and your sort of intellectual structure, in order to make that integrated approach work. A much simpler, safer option is to be clear about, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes rebutting their case, I'm going to make point 1 and 2, and make those points. So that now that I've made those 2 points, I want to move on to make some constructive arguments about why this is a good idea. 1, 2, 3, 4, go through those arguments. I think it's just a really easy way to minimize the chances that the adjudicator gets confused by your structure, and therefore marks your whole case down for that.
If you're really worried about structure, as a couple of training exercises I guess we can recommend. So these were just generally why they're important and things that you can do. But if you're training, I think a good thing to try to do is make a longer speech that you have made in a shorter amount of time. And it's not about speaking quickly, but about trying to organize your speech very well, and you remove things that are not important, right? So take a speech that you've already done. Let's say you did a debate yesterday and you were Prime Minister, and this was the speech that you made. Do that speech again, but instead of spending 7 minutes, spend 3 minutes doing that speech. Or the same thing, so that's step 1, do the speech again in a compressed way. Or just explain that speech to someone else, right? So I made a Prime Minister speech yesterday, and then today my activity, my exercise is, I'm going to explain my Prime Minister's speech yesterday to you. I'm not going to make that speech, I'm going to explain it. So I'm going to do like, first I start out by introducing myself because I think that's pretty cool. And then I tell a joke about what's important in this debate. And then I do my definition. And I highlight these points of definition. And then I do a background. And then I outline the 3 things in the debate, which are these 3 things. And then I explain the first thing. And then I provide an example. And then the second thing. So basically you are walking through your speech. And by doing that, you're thinking about why you are doing things at which part, right? So you're kind of imposing a post structure upon your speech. And I think if as a training exercise that helps you structurize or plan out your speech. And that's a couple of things I think you can do to kind of get into that structural mindset.
And my last tip, do you see that little piece of structure there? My last tip, setting up your expectations, what's about to happen next. My last tip is when you're still getting used to the idea of structure, if you're still a novice debater or you're trying to improve your structure, when you're in debates against more experienced teams, not only pay attention to their structure because you might learn good lessons from it, but in the debate itself, you can largely copy the structure of your opposing teams. It's not the best approach because it means that you're copying their priorities about what's important in the debate, and that's usually not a very good idea. But it's a much better idea than just having a messy kind of absence of structure. So if your opposition have said, our 3 points are going to be, A, B, and C, and they've given sort of little labels to those, then in your rebuttal you say, I'm going to structure my rebuttal as looking at A, B, and C. Now that might be unnecessary, that might be giving too much weight to some of their arguments, or it might be treating some of their arguments as separate when actually you can rebut them, 2 of them together by making the same piece of rebuttal, which might be more efficient. But when you're still learning, the adjudicator will always recognise when you've picked up some of the language of your opponents and use that to help structure your own speech, because it helps them be clear about, okay, that point that this person made, this is their response to that point, and this is their response to this other point. So only do that with really good teams, against more experienced teams. You don't want to copy the structure of less experienced teams because you'll be copying a lot of bad habits. And don't get stuck in that habit for too long because it means you're not learning your own way of prioritising arguments. But when you're new and you're not sure what to do, better to copy more experienced people in the debate.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because some structure is better than no structure. Even the very simple structure, even if it's just a chronological structure or a default, there's practical and principle. That's the split that I'm going to do in this debate, and that's the structure I'm going to use. Yep. Or the other team's structure, that's better than no structure. So that's question 1 we've done. We're going to go to this one now.
See, good method there. See, moving from first to second. Very good.
Transitioning.
Big tick, Logan.